Welcome everyone. My name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of the GovLab, and I'm delighted to have you all join us for the kickoff panel that will focus on the fourth wave of open data. And typically we add a question mark because it's actually also something that we would like to explore whether we are actually entering a fourth wave of open data, but that's the topic of today. And I'm delighted to be joined here with a stellar panel, which I will introduce in a second. But before we go there, let me set the stage somewhat about what we mean by a fourth wave of open data and what are some of the issues that we would like to tackle in this panel, but also in the ones that will follow, because this is part, as already mentioned, of a five kind of panel series that will try to explore the topics at hand in a 360 kind of degrees way. Next slide. Now, the fourth wave comes from previous work that we've done at the GovLab, where we've tried to identify different waves and also make sense of them with regard to how do you go about it in order to accelerate the different waves of open data. And a few years ago, we identified kind of three waves, and that was also published in our report on the third wave of open data, where we identified that typically, and of course, it's not always the case, but typically the open data movement follows kind of a three-pronged waves, or followed a three-pronged waves, where by which freedom of information was kind of the first wave that then got complemented with a focus on open government data. But then more recently, we also saw that open government data got complemented with access to private sector data through, for instance, data collaboratives as well. Next slide. Going a little bit more into detail, as I said, first wave focused on freedom of information. And what was different with other waves was that the first wave was really about data on request. It was basically about a right to know, right? So it was not pushed to you, but it was actually only available when you requested it. And that's, of course, still the case in many countries where they have FOIA legislation, for instance, enabling freedom of information. So it was pull focused. So you had to actually pull the data out of government in order to be able to use it. And a lot of the focus of freedom of information was at the national level, realizing, of course, that also the local level has FOIA and freedom of information legislation, but the main attention was at the national level. Now, a few years, about 10, 15 years ago, of course, that got complemented with the second wave, which was then mainly focused on open government data, data that was made available on a platform by default. And so this was then more about push than it was about pull. It was actually government pushing out data without being asked for it, which of course increased the availability of data and also increased the value of data. A lot of the focus of the second wave was then international, especially 10 years ago. There was a high buzz internationally about the potential of open government data. And then more recently, as I mentioned, those two waves got complemented by also starting to focus more on kind of access to private sector data for public interest purposes. In addition to that, we also saw that the open by default kind of principle got complemented by publish with purpose, which was really more about not just put everything on a platform, but put things on a platform that really serve a particular purpose, because the realization was that then value can be generated in a more targeted fashion as well. It was also more about partnerships, about data collaboratives, as I said, and of course, data collaboratives have many versions. That could be, for instance, a data pool. It could also be a data intermediary. But there was new organizations and institutions that entered the space in order to unlock data for the public interest. And what we also saw in the third wave was kind of an increased effort to align what happened at the subnational level and at the national level. Now, what we see, next slide, as a result of course, generative AI, we see that those three waves are, of course, still existing, and we can even argue to what extent, of course, they are actually existing in a positive way, because we can also perhaps address today that we see somewhat of a backsliding perhaps along those three waves globally and nationally. But what we also see is that generative AI has, of course, rephrased and reframed the role of open data. And the question that we have explored in a recent report, which was called A Fourth Wave of Open Data, exploring the spectrum of scenarios where open data serves generative AI, but also vice versa, we basically see that generative AI can be both a positive to improve generative AI and the outcome of generative AI by having access to high quality data that can augment, for instance, the data that is being used for instance, context specific generative AI application. But we also see that Gen AI can also be a positive to democratize data in its own right by providing a more conversational interface, but also, for instance, by making it easier to develop code books that can then be used to analyze data that is made available in the traditional open data way as well. And so that's what we hope to explore today is what is the impact of Gen AI? Does open data have a new role with regard to, for instance, training? Next slide. With regard to augmenting Gen AI, or whether it's also with regard to, for instance, generating new insights that can be accessed through, for instance, a chatbot as well. And these are, I'm not going to go into detail. These are kind of the scenarios that we have developed and identified in our report. And you can see there's no one way open data can be used for Gen AI. And there's also no one way how Gen AI can be used to improve or to democratize open data even more as well. Next slide. Now, we, of course, have tried to provide insight on how this actually happens. And for those who are interested, and we can also perhaps put the link in the chat here today, we actually have tried to map what is actually happening in real life by developing an observatory of examples where we show how, for instance, different actors are trying to provide a more conversational tool to access open data, but also where we see where open data actually really made a difference to a large extent. Next slide. Now, when we start looking into the intersection between open data and generative AI, there are a whole range of questions that emerge. And these are the questions that will determine the fourth wave of open data. And that's also what we will explore in this seminar series. The first question is open data actually ready to be used for AI? And that's a whole conversation that is emerging. And it's also a positive conversation in the sense is that the focus is really on quality and improving quality of open data. And I think that's a key manifestation of what we call the fourth wave of open data. The other aspect is whether the concept of open data also gets enriched by, for instance, experimentations and the advance of what is called data commons, where data is not just made accessible for all, but where there are some conditions on how you access data that are in alignment with preferences and expectations of communities. And so that's another manifestation of the fourth wave of open data. Then, as already mentioned, another manifestation is the use of Gen AI to make open data more conversational, where you don't have to have a data science degree anymore to actually interrogate data, but that you can just prompt, for instance, the data, and then you get an answer back in a more user-friendly fashion, including visualizations as well. And then, as already mentioned, the whole question is, of course, how does this impact data provenance? How does it impact data attribution, especially when you want to make reference to where the data came from and to be sure that the data was of high quality as well. And so those are kind of the four manifestations that we feel complement the previous three waves. And again, this is not about replacing the three waves that we have identified before because they remain important. And as I said, we can even have a discussion about what's the current state of the other three waves and should we actually pay more attention to them as well and not just focus on the fourth wave today. But it suffices to say is that these are elements that still are under construction, and this is kind of a very dynamic space. And we hope through this seminar series to actually get a better sense on what is the current state and also what are the complexities of actually moving into a fourth wave as well. Next slide. So what we hope to do in this five-pronged seminar series is to unpack this. And so these are the topics that we will discuss. One panel will focus on the conversational aspects of making data and open data more conversational, the conversational AI. Another panel will focus more on the data commons. Another one will focus on what does it mean to have AI-ready data. And then we will end by really thinking about what are some of the challenges and opportunities that we've learned and that we really need to take into account if we want to leverage the opportunity, if we believe it's a positive opportunity moving forward as well. But today, because we are kickstarting this event, we will basically set the stage. Next slide. On what is the current stage of the fourth wave of open data. And as I said, we have an amazing, stellar panel to do so. And so today, I'm delighted to be joined by three leaders in the space who have been very aligned with some of the thinking around the fourth wave as well. One is Renata Avila, and I hope she comes back, but I think she just dropped off. Perhaps she probably wanted to unmute and then click the wrong button. But Renata, I will introduce in a second again, but she is, of course, well known to many. She is the CEO of Open Knowledge, which, of course, as an organization has played a tremendous role. There is Renata, you're back. You might have pushed the wrong button, but I was just saying, Renata, that Open Knowledge has been kind of a signatory organization in the open data movement. And so we are delighted to have you join today to also reflect on, anyway, how is open data evolving? And from your perspective, are we entering a fourth wave? And then we have Gretchen Deo, who joins us from Paris. Some of you might know something is happening this week in Paris. It's called the AI Action Summit. And so Gretchen is the director at the Intellectual Property Right Group at Microsoft and is the leader, I would say, behind a lot of the open data work at Microsoft as well. And then we have Professor Anastasia Nikiforova, who calls us from Estonia, where she is a professor of information systems and also has been a key leader in kind of the scholarly community to explore this interaction between open data and Gen AI. And as you can see, this is going to be an amazing conversation as well. And perhaps if we could, yeah, click, I don't even have to ask. Let's dive straight in here because, of course, you're all joining us not to hear me, but to hear from our panelists. And let me start with Renata. And as I already set the stage, Renata, for you, you've been part of the open data movement for a while. And from your perspective, what are some of the trends and changes that you see, mainly as a result of Gen AI or AI in general? Over to you.
Okay, I will map like different changes depending on the actors. I think that citizens changed a lot, and the relationship of citizens with data changed fundamentally. Now citizens get that is a power relationship, and they understand the power in data to do things. You know, like the first interactions with generative AI also made them aware of the gaps when in their interaction. I mean, obviously, people. The first thing that many of people they have talked to do when they open an generative AI system is to ask about themselves. And then they ask about the place they come from. And then they ask about the discipline they are like experts on. And in these interactions, I think that it has been a massive, fast learning on the role that data and data gaps and data blind spots play with citizens. They also understand there's money in data, not only power, but money in data. And so in the last 10 years has been a gradual learning on considerations about privacy, considerations about control of governments, control of corporations, behavior analysis, and so on. So the citizens that we have today are far more aware and far more ready to advance a vision of rights in this area. Then governments changed. And if we talk about, in general, the relationship of governments with data, and concretely with open data, two things happen. It used to be in many countries incentive, something that make governments look good, to have a robust open data portal, and this push from governments to disclose information. And then geopolitics happened. And I think that the conflict in Ukraine and other conflicts led to a fragmentation and led to a dynamic that governments not only wanted to be more opaque with their citizens, but also vis-a-vis other governments. Sharing information became I can tell you from the experience of Open Knowledge Foundation, data portals went dark immediately as conflicts started. And data that was usually trusted, like governments used to be like a trusted source of data, have been contested. I think that the pandemic also played a role on it, on the credibility of citizens or other states or other actors in the data that is being released as open data. The other thing that it also changed is, the dynamics in civil society. I think that a very I would say a very robust open data movement that we had in 2010 faded away and dispersed itself in different areas. Some group of people went to continue doing the civic tech. Other people went to the AI. Other people went to privacy. So, and also the funding of those organizations. If you think of the last, since the closure of the FCO the changes in the UK, for example, the UK used to be one of the main donors of open data movement, and then CEDA as well, Sweden, and then followed by, and now they're following the trend, the US, but also private foundations. It stopped being like a sexy topic to fund. So of course, a lot of people move to different interests. I think a lot remains, but I think that I wish in this moment, and I'm going to the tools now, I wish we had the enthusiasm and the resources of 2010 with the tools that we have today, because what the tools that we have today are quite amazing. I mean, all the excitement is in the tools, because the ability of do much with large data sets that we had in 2010. I mean, if we could put out a very nice tableau, or a very nice graph, it was super celebrated and exciting. And now, to answer your question, generative AI allows us to do so much more, and to connect in unprecedented ways with citizens. Let citizens dialogue with the data. Let citizens have a completely different experience with the data sets. Let organizations, public interest organizations, accelerate incredibly not only the campaign side of things, but the discovery side of things, identify problems at unprecedented levels, even fill data gaps with simulated data, synthetic data, and so on. So I think that if we look at all these changes, I think that we have a tremendous and very sad mismatch of the abilities of the tools to do something out of it, and the readiness of the citizens to grab the moment to do amazing things in the public interest. I think that also austerity in governments influence, because countries that were not affected by geopolitics were affected by the geopolitics of finance, and many of the budgets that were allocated for the offices of open data were scrapped after during and after the pandemic, and then you have, from the side of the government and from the side of the citizens, even if we are in a key moment where we could do amazing things for the portals of access of information or for commercial data for small and medium enterprises, we don't have the capacity unless it is some countries and the private sector. I do two more things. I know that I'm taking a lot of time, but I think they're important for the conversation. Data used to be the key, the king. I will say that now we have data as the king, and we have metadata as the queen. And metadata is the moment of metadata is, organizations of mind, we have been giving equal importance to data and metadata since day one, because we knew that this moment will come. And the metadata quality is an issue that we are going to you hear a lot about. The second thing is the legal aspects around open data. Before we were dealing with freedom of information laws and some copyright issues. Now copyright issues are gaining prominence in ways that we don't know. Lots of litigations going on, and we don't know where they are going to end. But also, interestingly, competition law is entering the room, and competition law can be a key to activate at least the supply of open data if we consider data and a key competitive component that can unlock the power of AI in other competitors. And in general, we used to have influential countries in open data. Now we have moved to influential sectors. So issues around climate, issues around transport, and issues around disasters or pandemics are becoming those are the sectors that are pushing for data to be released or to be produced. Before it was big champions of open data, governments and cities. Now we move to sectors across the globe, global issues. So that's my brief. I would say, I will reiterate, I wish we had the enthusiasm and resources of 2010 for this moment to address this, to surf the fourth wave instead of being drown on it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Renata. And you've given me already kind of 15 areas where we can go next, and I'm sure we will come back to that. And typically, when I facilitate, I always forget things. And so one thing I forgot was to tell the audience here that you can also engage. And so we have a Q&A function here. So feel free to ask questions to the panelists, and then we will address them as they emerge or at the end as well. So let's go to Anastasia. And so as I already introduced you, you've done a lot of work on open data in general, but also now more recently, of course, you've been kind of in the forefront of really exploring how Gen AI is changing the whole open data kind of pipeline. And so eager to hear from you, Anastasia, what are some of the areas that you see changing that you feel are kind of important to be aware of? And are they indications of exactly this fourth wave, whether or not we are riding the wave, as Renata was referring to? Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. I will be more than happy to elaborate on my ideas. So they will be overlapping a bit with what you have already kindly mentioned when you have introduced this seminar, and also what Renata have mentioned, because I'm putting a note, and actually I have a sort of 5 pages written of what I would love to put here, but of course I will not have time for this. So perhaps let me start just with a very quick reference to make a bridge between the past and to the future with regards to data and AI, or generative AI as we are talking today, because we can see the shift of dynamics between democratization of 2 elements of data and AI, because it is also very relevant to what Renata mentioned. So basically in 2010 we had enthusiasm around open data. So basically we have experienced a very increased democratization of the data, of the open data, I would say, whereas democratization of AI was rather a dream of ours, so that we would love to have, but it was just a dream of whereas it will be true or not. It was just a very open question, because it was very relatively restricted, to say, due to high computing power, due to limited access to large data sets that we now possess finally, and also due to expertise barriers. Whereas if we talk about today, we can experience, we can see actually the vice versa, the opposite, I would say. We see democratization of AI. So it is the dream that finally came into truth. Whereas with regards to the data, I would not say that it is indeed the case. So it is not even a progression from what we had before, and it is a stagnation in what we refer to be a data winter. And whereas there will be this data spring or not, and whereas this spring will be influenced by generative AI, this remains to be a question, and only the time will show. Because from my perspective at the moment, there are both trends around this in favor and against favor of this spring, especially with relation to different data producers. So if we talk about governments, I would say that generative AI could influence positively this data democratization and data openness, since we have this AI innovation as a buzzword, and perhaps governments would love to really to leverage from this, and perhaps we would see a bit more data openings on both on national and also local municipalities levels, which is very, very crucial at the moment, because if national data is more or less openly available and fine, I wouldn't say that it is the case for municipal data as well, whereas it is of very high benefit, potential benefit for the whole society. But at the very same time, it is, of course, not only about this data which is being opened by governments, but it is also about the data to be provided by citizens and private sector, where generative AI, of course, could postpone a bit this democratization even more, I would say, because we can observe a sort of a data hoardings by AI leaders, because it is a competitive advantage to have this data, and those private sector representatives, of course, would not be willing to share this data. As such, I would say that generative AI have now this influence over data sharing with both positive and negative with regards to the stakeholder, to the data producer and data publisher we are covering. But of course, it is not only about data opening and having this data open, but of course, it is also about utilization of the data, where generative AI, in my opinion, possess the most transformative role, I would say. And probably it is exactly what we would love to cover today. And I would say that generative AI possess a very have a role in all the aspects of the data ecosystem. I would not go into the very detail of what the data ecosystem consists of, because we have conceptualized this together with colleagues of mine in one of the studies, and it is pretty heavy concept to say. So I will very simplify it and put it, and we'll see through the lenses of diamond model or golden triangle, to say, so that technology, process, and data, and we add on top of it people. And I would say that generative AI will affect all these components through automation or augmentation. This depends, whereas typically we do observe this tendency towards automation, but I would say that augmentation would be something more feasible to go with, because human interventions, at least at the moment, are very crucial in the very many aspects. Otherwise, when we talk about more specific examples, I would say it is about user experience, user system interaction, where user is both data consumer, and it is also what have been slightly mentioned by Renata, and user, it is also data publisher. And here I would say that we will see an increased number of conversational agents, because this is something that have not been very widely implemented in open government data portals before, whereas today it is, we could say, we also observe some sort of democratization of these tools to be put on those portals, because they are cheaper to produce, so not so very many resources, whereas human time or economic resources are needed for this. Whereas these conversational agents will become a bit more advanced compared to what this has been before, and it will be more about natural language conversation, so that users, even those which do not possess very high data literacy levels, to say so, who are not data experts, will be most probably able to have a chat with those chatbots and virtual assistants. It will be also about the reduction of language barriers, because multilingualism will not be such a great issue beforehand generative AIs, which is very important for very many countries, especially those where the languages are small or endangered, because, for instance, I'm coming from Latvia but work in Estonia, and of course we do not have very many opportunities to really to work with data in our own languages, whereas generative AI is a key to fill this gap. It is also about recommender systems, I would say, which are not expected anymore to be so primitive as they have been before, such as tag-based recommendation systems, were the most advanced ones we could really find on the portals. Whereas now we are unlocking the era where we can have these semantic relationships used in our recommender systems, and as such, having those recommendations significantly more advanced, and not only within one portal, but also across different portals, I would say, there will be expanding this ecosystem. It is also about, of course, what Renata mentioned, it is also about synthetic data. It is one of my favorite topics at the moment. And actually being both, not to say fan of synthetic data, but rather very optimistic about the synthetic data, and also very negatively, having a very negative sentiment around it. But this will definitely allow us to have more data, and especially the data coming from critical sectors where we, in the past, we would not be able to really imagine to have this data, such as medical healthcare related data, where privacy concerns were preventing us from having this data. So synthetic data could be something that could allow us to have this data finally publicly available. And yeah, with this, I think that my time is running out, and perhaps I will stop here because we will probably continue this discussion afterwards at some point.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, Anastasia, for again a very dense and rich opening. I think you're all basically setting the stage for sure on what this fourth wave could be, and you already have identified multiple areas where indeed we see innovation and that might lead to a democratization. It's very interesting that also you are not as optimistic about the democratization of data, but that there are tools, as Renata also referred to, tools that we currently have that actually we should start using for bridging some of the gaps that might exist as well. And there are already a few questions in the Q&A, so feel free to add to that, and I will come back to that as well. But I want to first give Gretchen the floor. Thanks for being so patient. And so Gretchen, anyway, you're within Microsoft doing a lot of work around open data. You were kind of leading the open data campaign for Microsoft. So from your perspective, how do you see this evolving? And of course, anyway, Microsoft is very heavily involved also in generative AI. So what's kind of the perspective from the private sector to the developments that we are seeing in the so-called fourth wave?
Sure. Thank you, Stefan, and really happy to be here as part of the panel today. I also, too, have a lot of notes already, so getting a lot from the conversation already. But thank you for the question. I guess first at a high level, generative AI and developments in generative AI are really fast moving, and it's an area that's just rapidly evolving, and where there's a lot of potential to apply generative AI to different problem sets, whether they be societal or economic. And as we think about those opportunity areas, I do think that that interplay between open data and AI should be approached to consider an approach that is, engenders trustworthiness, responsibility, and be broadly beneficial. We do want to, especially as a maker, as you noted, as a maker of AI tools, we do want to ensure that AI is scaled in such a way that is broadly beneficial and can benefit everyone. So that's sort of a high level from a maker of AI too. And then as I think about this intersection of open data and AI, I do think about it through kind of two aspects, which is sort of the inputs and the outputs. So from an inputs perspective, generative AI really does rely on vast and varied data sets for training a model that's really well performing and less prone to bias. So in order for in the training process for the model to draw themes, patterns, correlations, access to data at scale is often needed. So that vast data. And then especially if it's in a case where it's being fine-tuned to a specific scenario, access to context-specific data can be really important. So looking at it through that lens, I do think that it's important to consider access to data for really the global community of AI developers, and especially including for startups, open source developers, AI researchers, where that access to public data is especially important. I mean, I have the resourcing that a Microsoft of the world. It is important for kind of the development of safe and well-performing AI that there is that access to vast and varied data. So that's sort of a reflection on the input side. And then on the output side, I would just echo some of what's already been said, which is I do think it's very exciting to think about how we can progress what has been traditional open data portals, where open data is there and is certainly valuable, but still you may need some degree of expertise to draw that data down, to then look at the data and draw insights from it. Whereas now we can look at it through the lens of having some sort of AI application or interface on that data so that somebody can interact it within a more conversational way and a more natural way, ask questions of the data without having to have that data science expertise and skill set. So hopefully that application of generative AI can make data much more accessible and enable more people to draw insights from it. So that would be a reflection on the output side. There are a number of different layers, but just broadly speaking, it can kind of reflect on that interplay between open data and AI in both that inputs and outputs lens.
Great, and I like the way you framed it in a much better way than how I started off this conversation, because indeed I think it has kind of the input, the output kind of possibility to transform, right? So transform how Gen AI is trained by providing more access to context-specific data, and then of course and high quality data. And then the output is indeed what Anastasia and Renata was also referring to, is kind of a new relationship with data by the citizens. Now, let's go a little bit into, and again, I have like 500 possible questions here, but one key question, of course, is that is open data ready for being an asset and being a real source to improve generative AI. And as you mentioned, Gretchen, it can become a real important data asset for training, for fine-tuning, for RAG models and the like. But key question is, of course, is actually open data ready? Which is also a question, of course, that that the Department of Commerce asked a few months ago in the US, and there was a whole variety of responses. So let me go to perhaps Renata, and anyway, I will eventually change the order. But Renata, you, of course, might have a view on that, given your expertise in that area. Over to you.
Open government data quality is terrible. That's an issue that hasn't been solved. It is terrible even in developed countries, not let alone in developing countries. It is published and pushed out as open data, but it is not. It doesn't, like so many times. It takes a lot. I mean, now with the tools that we have, might take less. But it is data quality and data and the ability to authenticate the data and so on are like big issues still. However, when you think about generative AI, there's another set, and now I'm entering the GLAM area, the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums area, where because it usually have been made about like big, large corpus of digital objects. We can be considered unstructured data, have been made available by librarians or by curators, that tends to be a little bit better in terms of quality, because the metadata is quite okay, and usually is being dedicated to the public domain, so you don't have to deal with copyright issues. It is a completely, like, we never thought that it would be like, we wanted to make culture accessible to people, but I think that we always struggle to find the business model and the narrative around the potential benefits of it, and now we have it clear. So I think that in terms of tabular data is terrible, but it might be now better. There's no better time than today to improve that quality because of all this four-way push. But unstructured data coming from libraries, archives, museums, it tends to be really good quality. And the challenge there is sustainability, because again, politics and budget cuts. Many of these very valuable trove of data that is in the public domain might not be available for the small actors to play with. Because of hosting costs and so on. So that's in my humble opinion, and the metadata is terrible across the tabular data. Is good in that kind of specific unstructured data. That's my view from the ground.
Yeah,
I know that
that's
many people might have more sophisticated views on this.
It was a clear view and well pronounced, Renata. And what I also liked about your intervention was that it also opened up the kind of the view that when we talk about open data, we're not just talking about tabular data anymore, right? Because obviously, and I would say that's actually also a key element of the fourth wave that perhaps we should make more pronounced, that when we talk about data that can be used for Gen AI and to improve how Gen AI performs or improves the variety of use cases that are culturally diverse as well, it's not just tabular data anymore. I would say, anyways, some might argue that actually tabular data is less important in a context of Gen AI, but that now from an open data movement, we actually also have to start looking into unstructured data, multi-format kind of data as well. And I think I like the fact that you brought the archives and the libraries into the equation as well. So Anastasia, over to you quickly. I think Renata has mentioned the queen on set occasions, which is metadata, which I like as kind of the other metaphor. So what's your sense? Do we need new metadata standards? Do we need new data provenance standards? I mean, there's a lot of work in that space. I don't know whether you have worked on that as well, but eager to hear what your sense is.
Thank you very much, because for the vast majority of things, I fully agree with Renata, because indeed data quality management is the second topic I'm dealing with, and as such, I do know that for sure that open data quality is not good enough at all, including but not limited to the fact that actually open government data community for some reason is underestimating the role of data quality, and especially of the traditional understanding of data quality as it comes from data quality management perspective. Because oftentimes it is reduced just for the definition that we have data, we have some metadata, and metadata are more or less complete, and in the best case, it is also accurate. Whereas it is insufficient, because it is what I tend to say to my student, it is a sort of what I would refer to be a presentational level of data set, whereas it is not about the data in general, because we have to really to be sure in the quality of the data content, which is exceptionally crucial now with generative AI, which is fed by this data. But referring back to the point you have mentioned, so with regards to metadata, we have plenty of standards, and unfortunately they do not really provide an evidence to work very effectively, because actually they exist for years. But at the very same time, since we are talking about generative AI, I would love to also to stress the point that I do believe that generative generative AI is capable to contribute to metadata quality improvement, which is already something that is happening around, because even students of mine are working on the data preparation processes, augmentation, and streamlining, including simplifying and streamlining metadata generation. So by having data sets to generate at least partially this metadata, which is not expected to be an automated process in a full, because as mentioned before, I'm very reluctant towards the idea that we will have everything to be automated, especially in these years. So I do consider that it should be augmentation where human intervention is still needed, whereas it is something that could help us a lot, because metadata per se in open data domain is something that probably is not as qualitative as we would love to, due to the additional burden which would be expected to be added on the top of daily routines of those people who are publishing this data. So metadata itself, for the data they are having in their information systems, is sufficient to really to deal with this data. Whereas when they are publishing this data becomes third-party data, and to this end we have to possess significantly more qualitative metadata, so as a description of the data, in order to be able to understand, interpret, and use this data in the future. And here comes this issue, because we also conducted one study together with local municipalities in Estonia, trying to identify various what are the main barriers towards preventing them from opening the data, or what are the challenges they face while they are opening this data. And metadata preparation is one of those key barriers they do possess, where they do believe that some sort of automation or at least augmentation would have a very good would serve their needs. At the same time, just to put a reference to what Renata also mentioned, is indeed that for prioritized data such as cultural heritage data and etc., we do observe that metadata quality and data quality in general is a bit better. So when we have some resources such as financial resources, support from European Union funds, if we do talk about European countries or any other entities, it really contributes very positively towards the overall quality of this metadata. And as such, I would love also to assume and to hope that with time, at least in Europe, this problem will be tackled at least a bit due to high value data sets concept. So more and more data are being now prioritized, and we have those clear guidelines. Of course, we do not like those guidelines so that someone dictates us what to do. But anyways, it seems that to be the only way on how to really ensure that quality isn't there, because at least some very basic metadata quality requirements are already in those regulations posed by European Commission. Of course, they are currently adopted predominantly in Europe, but we see that more and more countries are also getting this and mapping onto their open data initiatives, as we just observed together with a colleague of mine in Thailand, because they are doing the same as the European Union is doing, whereas in Australia we had also some similar initiatives. So I don't know to what extent I stick to the question of yours, because there are a bit of deviations, but I just want to put so many things.
It was a very rich deconstruction of the question, which I liked very much. And I think you tackled on some things that exactly are important to emphasize, is that exactly metadata is important. We need to update them, but also we can actually use Gen AI to generate documentation in a much faster and more high quality fashion as well. And also, anyway, it also goes back to another reflection that perhaps we can have a conversation about as well, which is, yeah, we can have a long discussion about we need access to data, but some data matters more than others depending on the use case that we prioritize, right? And I think that's something that perhaps we don't have enough discussion about, is that what are some of the use cases for which we really need data in order to make progress, whether it's in the context of disaster response or anyway, cultural diversity and so on. But then the question is also, and going back to you, Gretchen, is of course, some of that data might be culturally sensitive, might also not be able to really provide fully open, which is why, and Renata has worked on that as well, why there is this move to think about data commons, right? Where you actually have kind of data made accessible, but access is still somewhat aligned with the expectations and with the preferences of the communities, whether these are professional communities or whether these are communities that care about cultural heritage, as Renata was referring to, and so on, right? So what do you see the role of data commons to be in kind of the next wave of open data, Gretchen?
Sure, absolutely. I do think, I mean, GovLab has already done a lot of great work in thinking in this space about what do data commons look like in the AI era. And I do think they, may look different than commons of the past. And so shaping what can be most beneficial in establishing data commons that are useful for generative AI. I do think a lot of the aspects that your team, Stefan, has highlighted are really important. A few examples of which being, that the development of data commons are community driven, that they are have input from a community, that they can reflect what the community is looking for, that they are developed in such a way that enables more equitable access. Again, we were talking earlier about, the public data is especially important for some of these smaller entities like the startups and researchers, and ensuring that there is some type of exploration of governance that can ensure the equitable access and enable also the benefits to flow back to those communities would be important. Sustaining data commons, what does that look like to ensure that data remains usable and effective? So I think all these attributes are really important to consider, and I think we're seeing more of entities kind of considering these aspects as they're producing open data and trying different models, which I think is kind of the way to do it right now, is testing models, seeing what works for their communities or the groups that they're trying to reach with this data. So I would say that that's a big role that data commons can take. And then in terms of the data itself, some of what's already been reflected here in the conversation, but we've done some work to kind of look at what data is most useful, or how can it be prepared in ways that are most useful, and kind of centered it around making sure that data is discoverable, accessible, and usable. So discoverable is simply that it can be found or even digitized. So much content is not even digitized. So thinking about that. Accessible, that it's machine readable primarily, and usable, that it has applicable metadata applied, it's cleaned, formatted. And there are ways that you can consider prioritization of where to put your focus, because, and as has been already reflected in the conversation, generative AI in particular really thrives on unstructured data sets. So like longer texts or unique data or authoritative data sources can be especially useful. So kind of there are ways to prioritize. It can be hard to, put all data through that lens of usability, but there are ways to kind of prioritize looking at it through that way. But so yeah, there are a couple of ways to look at it, both through how the data commons are established and how access is enabled, and then the data that's in the data commons themselves, and looking at how to make that most usable.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. And let me quickly also ask Renata, and then I go to the questions that the audience also have. But I want to make sure, Renata, because of course one element in this whole thing is also, which Open Knowledge has done a lot of work on, is kind of rethinking also kind of licensing context, and then how does that relate to data commons as well, right? And so I want to make sure that we bring you in on that topic, because anyway, I want to feature what Open Knowledge is doing there as well.
Okay, so very quickly is we are working. We understand in this fourth wave, we are moving from a license system of release and open data, to an ecosystem. License is not enough. We need new governance rules. We need new technical tools. We need more different, as Gretchen said, different configurations depending on different communities, to bring this idea of the data commons into reality. And of course, the data pools of a community of, cancer patients patients will be like completely different from a community of, like folklore music, completely different. So what we are exploring at the Open Knowledge Foundation is precisely that, which are the preferences of the communities and which are the incentives to share. If I go back to what I said in the beginning on how citizens changed and how their attitude towards works, digital works and data sets changed completely, we need to ask them, go back and ask the community. We have to the next 3 years in collaboration with CNRS in France, we are going to ask these questions. And just to mention an example, one source of high quality data is open research data. But the incentives for open science and open research data are completely distorted. So my intuition is that this research will lead to a lot of, will shed light in the ideal incentives for communities to share in better terms, according to their preferences, but according to their interests as well. I will share the link so not to steal more time from the people.
Great, thanks, Renata. And so yeah, let's go to the audience, because I want to make sure that this also answers the questions of people that have joined. And so one question is from Ivan, which links more to kind of the data winter that we have emerging as a result of also what's happening at the level of open government data as well. And so so the question here: are there isolated attempts to archive data by individual activists and group, but there is no global initiative for this task? So basically, it's about how do you archive data that might disappear? Is there a need for a global kind of effort there? And I don't know, Anastasia, whether you want to address that, or Renata, which is kind of one manifestation of the data winter. Of course, there are multiple manifestations, but one of them is, of course, the disappearance of data, and we've seen this in a variety of countries, right? It's not unique, for instance, to the US. We actually have seen it in other places as well, but of course, the latest is there. Anastasia and Renata, yeah. I mean, you can give the baton to Renata if you. But anyway, over to you.
I will try to give my response very short, because actually it refers to only one concept I would like to pose here. So maybe two. Yeah, there is a debate around various historical data per se is of value, and basically we can observe it even with regards to the current open data portals which are still alive. So we have to focus only on real-time data, because some users do possess an opinion that only real-time data really brings the value, whereas I'm claiming that of course it is not true. Yeah, real-time data may pose a very, very high value, whereas it is not to depreciate the value of historical data. So with this is to say that I would say that whatever data it is of great importance, especially since we are putting this into the context of generative AI and synthetic data generation, because synthetic data generation works over historical data. And here I just made an equal sign of those portals which had the data in the past to historical data. So it is a sort of prerequisite to my response. And other than that, yeah, I would then say that it is crucial. Of course, even within my response as regards putting a link between this historical data and synthetic data, of course, there are some precautions which yet to be taken into account. So I'm not possessing that it will be a silver bullet then, so that we have this historical data and we generate synthetic data on the top. Of course, it is again associated with the data governance need and necessity, I would say, because the more historical data it is, the more likely there are some biases, so that our synthetic data will also possess some biases and etc. But this is to say that it is a good reference point, good input to have. And as such, I would say that all the initiatives that exist in order to really to keep this data alive to a certain extent should be favored. Whereas it is expected to be done centralized or not, this is another question, because if it is expected to be, who would be in charge? And we do know that there are no many entities who likes to have some additional daily activities and duties. Whereas other than that, so yeah, if activists and groups would tackle this would be wonderful. But of course, the more standardization, the more centralization of the process is in place, the better. But if the question is rather about various, we have to preserve this data. My answer would be yes, for sure.
Great. Thanks for that, Anastasia. And Renata, you raised your hand, and perhaps you can also address.
She covered everything.
You covered
sorry.
everything. All right, so that's thing, and it touches also what I think Bill was referring to with regard to. Anyway, is there a need for kind of also anyway, as Anastasia said, protection of historical data? Is there a need for kind of a legal enforcement of kind of open data mandate? For instance, Renata, you want to address that?
Okay, I will add to this, and I have been pushing for that since 3 years. We need to look back at the freedom of information laws and advance them. They were done in the era of paper and PDFs, and we now live in very different time. We should have the judiciary should have the laws can open up opportunities in the judiciary to force some data to be released or some data to be even produced. So I'm a big advocate for that, and that's something that might be like the fifth wave. I don't know.
Yeah, so there you go. We're gonna have next week. We will, Renata, be inviting you to the fifth wave of open data once we figure out new freedom of information approaches. But I totally agree with you. Is that there is need for updating there. At the same time, anyway, I think it's quite often not enough recognized the importance of freedom of information, right, in the whole open data kind of community. Sometimes we forget about it. Then there's a question from Charlotte with regard to open source. And so regarding the democratization of Gen AI tools to improve the accessibility and reusability of data, what role do you see for the open source community, and what would be incentives to develop such tools in open source? And so I'm not sure, Gretchen, whether you want to address some of that, because obviously you're also at in Paris at the moment. And again, big topic at the AI Action Summit was, of course, the whole topic of open source as well. And so, but also open source kind of platforms like GitHub, for instance, have kind of a new role to play in this context as well, right? So over to you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, two things come to me immediately to mind with that question. One is more from a platform perspective, and GitHub is one of the largest sources of open data. It's especially a useful platform to host smaller open data sets, and that's incredibly invaluable and helpful to have that as a resource. So, I mean, open data is an open source. Or sorry, GitHub is an open source platform, but also hosts a lot of open data. So just recognizing that as a tool. And then also the other thing that comes to mind is, I think part of what enabled the sort of open source revolution is the community, is the people that were able to collaborate off of each other. And you've got open source developers. There are like professions and communities built up around it. And I think there's an opportunity to see that come to play with data, open data as well. Having that community, people that are focused on open data, working with open data, building off of each other. I think that could enable a real open data revolution, as it did with open source. So the people behind it, I think, are key.
Great. Renata, Anastasia, do you want to tackle open source as well? Because this is going to come back on set occasions. Like, it's such a big topic, and of course there are different anyway, the different discussions about what is open source AI, right? But and Renata and I had the the privilege of being in a 2-day session on that topic. But Renata, you wanna address some of that as well?
Yes, just want to address something, and I haven't seen the granular data, but the economic impact in different countries and the gig work dynamic in the tech industry has, as a result, we have seen a decrease in contributions in open source projects, especially in public interest open source projects. So we cannot divorce We cannot rely on a community that is not that is disconnected from, healthy economies with incentives for young people to have, like, free spare time, access to hard work, and the time to dedicate to these projects, which I think there is an area that we need to be more aware of. And the solution for that is as well, public institutions can play a big role if they embrace open source and dedicate part of the budget that they have of their staffers to contribute to contribute to open source projects. People already with a job and a salary, or universities doing the projects and pilots, as Anastasia is doing, that it is what keeps the communities alive. Not necessarily, no longer, the ability to dedicate a lot of time to it.
Great. Anastasia, you want to address that as well, or?
Yeah, perhaps just a very couple buzzwords to say. So yeah, I would definitely agree with the ladies, and also would suggest that actually this would contribute significantly to the trust to both to data to AI. And in this way, it would be possible to really to achieve better inclusivity and equitability. And also in certain scenarios, depending on how to proceed with this, to address the needs of marginalized communities, which is not to forget, so that we do not exclude a certain groups of people. And this would also tackle what concerns me a bit at the moment. I mean, knowledge monopolization. So the more we are moving towards open whatever, the better, because we are avoiding their busy knowledge monopolization, which is currently in the hands of AI giants. And yeah, finally, although perhaps it is indirectly contributing, but nevertheless, it would contribute to what currently is expected to be the hottest topic, I would say, to the responsible AI. So the more we are listening to each other, the more open source open communities, open source tools, and etc., they directly or indirectly contribute to it. And this is the only way to go, because again, this would contribute then to trust and inclusivity, to equitability, and to sustainability of both of data as just an artifact, and also for AI, but of course to the product of AI coupled with this data.
Great. So let's get Gretchen, and again, we have an hour and a half, but it doesn't have to be anyway, because people are. Gretchen has spent kind of 4 days already talking about this thing, so I don't want to push it here. But you're, as was mentioned, you're at the AI Action Summit, and so eager to hear, Gretchen, how does this resonate? How does this resonate at the global level, right? So is kind of the whole issue of access to data, and specifically, of course, the role of open government data, for instance, and data commons, is that a topic that has received sufficient attention, or is kind of the focus, and it seems to me that a lot of the focus is now on the computational resources that are needed to actually train data, but then not on kind of the real source, which is data, right? And so, anyway, I don't want to give the answer already, but I'm trying to see anyway whether anyway is what from your sense what kind of is the lesson learned from the AI Action Summit with regard to the topics that we discussed?
Yeah, I would just say I would completely agree with the point that I think so much of attention by countries and governments today is on the AI infrastructure, on talent, which is incredibly important, but so much less so on data, which is what really enables the development of AI. And so I do think there's an opportunity to have much more discussion there, and also just the role of policies or governments that can incentivize. I think there's just a big opportunity to incentivize more open data, whether that's more government open data or even just enabling, research entities, nonprofits, providing real incentives to create those open data sets, which can be, again, kind of going to the reflective of the communities that where we need more data to be more broadly representative. So I think it's a big opportunity area, and certainly, you're seeing that conversation in pockets, but I think that the focus has been, broadly on sort of the chips, the talent, and we do need more conversation on the data side.
Great. Renata, I want to also have your perspective on, because a lot of this discussion quite often is kind of very much, global north kind of discussions as well, right? And so eager to hear from you, Renata, with regard to the kind of the global majority, how does this fourth wave of open data, is this embraced? Is this, are there other challenges that we should take into account that, in addition to the computational challenges, of course, and the talent challenges, that you feel like this is something that we also need to add to the table in order to make this conversation not just kind of narrowly focused on a few countries that can afford, right?
I think that, and it actually connects with one of the questions asked in the chat. I think that it poses a challenge of fast, skipping waves.
Yeah.
And fast forwarding a different vision of a data policy in a given country. Instead of copy pasting the old days data policies, I think open data policies, I think that the challenge for countries and cities in the global south, and as well as initiatives, is to imagine a different open data world that corresponds to this wave. Because it is misleading to say, why will I start with the practices that will take me forever and a lot of resources if I can apply the tools of today to my open data vision? Why would I start with the basics if I can go to a more sophisticated and interactive solution that talks to my citizens investing the same amount of money? I think that it is also a lot of catch up and a very not national feeling. It's a more like group feeling that I want to be a part of it. I don't want to be left out of these specifically AI. So I think that it is the regions I interact with and I'm familiar with are very excited about the tooling. Like the results of a generative AI and how can they apply it to open data. And I guess that the enthusiasm is facing a wall again of lack of resources and lack of spaces to accelerate the possibilities, because many countries are engaged in drafting AI policies in the global south without having even an open data adequate open data policy or initiative. So they are dreaming of AI without having the input. So
Right.
that's my view of it.
Yeah.
We need to reconnect.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you, is that anyway, everyone is jumping on the AI governance bandwagon, but or the AI kind of action plan, but then anyway, there is no data governance or no open data policy, which also relates to a question that Andrew puts in the chat, which might be very specialized for those from the US, but the the US Department of Commerce recently, after several years of kind of expectation, issued kind of new guidelines on open data and best practices, and also as it relates to kind of artificial intelligence, which I think, I'm not sure which one is in the chat here, but of course, well, as I mentioned, the Department of Commerce also had, of course, issued this kind of request for input with regard to how do you make open data AI ready as well. So I don't know, Gretchen, do you want to respond to that, or but it goes back to kind of a broader question, which Renata started as well. What should open data policy look like in 2025 to actually take the kind of fourth wave into account, if I may use that, or the fifth wave, to anticipate the fifth wave, as Renata was referring to. So are there some issues, Gretchen, that you feel like these are kind of policies that are missing at the moment, or policies that should be updated? I mean, it's kind of a big question, but nobody has an answer. And then Anastasia, you might have some ideas as well from kind of a European perspective, right? Because there's no shortage of European kind of interventions, but are they sufficient, right? Over to you, Gretchen, first.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. I mean, I thought it was fantastic to see what the Department of Commerce issued in their report. I do think that goes to enabling really practical advice and guidance, and I think that's sort of step one. Microsoft did. There was as you mentioned, Stefan, there was a request for information period, and we did respond to that with what I mentioned earlier, which was how to think about making data discoverable, accessible, and usable, and how to think about prioritization of data if you're looking at it through that lens. So those were kind of some of our reflections, but I thought it was really great to see the Department of Commerce lead that effort and provide guidance that could be broadly applicable across government agencies. So that was fantastic from like a best practices and kind of guidance standpoint. And then from a policy standpoint, I guess I would just go to this sort of thinking around incentives. I mean, I just think there's so much data that could be made available, but agencies may not have the resourcing. They may not have the incentive structure set up to get that data out there. So now is really this opportune time in this sort of AI era of where this diversity of data and the great quality of data that actually governments do have that could be made more available, more accessible for AI. And how do you incentivize that and enable resourcing for agencies to be able to do that, because it does take resourcing if it's digitizing or cleaning data. That's all resourcing, and so just thinking about how to enable that from a practical standpoint, I think there's an opportunity there.
Great, that's valuable insight here for sure. Anastasia, from your perspective, kind of within the European context, because you have several acts now, from kind of the Data Governance Act to I'm not going to go to all 5 of them that are determining the current landscape, but from your point of view, is there a need to even do what, for instance, the Department of Commerce did, which was kind of a public conversation about how do we actually make open data AI ready, right? And I think, which in that, as Gretchen said, was actually quite a really interesting, and I haven't seen many other countries actually do this kind of consultation about their open data, right?
Yeah, I do agree for sure that all the conversations and all the consultations are very, very much needed, because probably this would be something that we have in Europe some sort of semi-consultations with regards to the documents being prepared, where when they become available for to the wide audience in order to be commented and to have some dialogue. But anyways, it seems to be something rather for the check to have. So it is not a very active discussion, I would say, and it is taking place rather in the middle of the process, or rather closer to the very end of the process, but not at the very beginning. And as such, I would say that indeed conversation and consultation at very early stages would be very much needed, because it is also what we observe at lower levels here in Estonia and back in Latvia. When we academia are having some conversations with government, our opinions are very, very different, but they are very complementary. And the more we are talking, the more we can come to some consensus. Whereas I also do not believe that only academia and government are capable to make decisions, because we have to listen to all the opinions of all the different stakeholders. But even when 2 stakeholders are gathered together in one room, this already provides a very great benefit towards the developed, be it a directive, be it an incentive or anything. And while we do have a lot of acts indeed here in Europe. Perhaps it is that case when it is not about the quantity, but rather about the quality, to say. So whereas I would love now to a bit to not to criticize, but rather to say what I would prefer to see a bit more stressed in those acts in a bit more implicit way, because of course this is covered to a certain extent, but not so very expressive as I would love to see. It is not to say that I am suggesting to have yet another new act or something like that. It is rather just my personal opinion, so that actual things are simple enough. So what we are stressing here today for very many times, AI readiness of the data to be stressed in a better way with the reference to all those dimensions we have. So availability of the data and breadth and depth of these data, acknowledgement of any biases in the data, acknowledgement of the purpose of the data collection, so that this is very well known, because various some of those aspects are mentioned to a certain extent in those documents. They are not positioned to be something very crucial, whereas I would read rather omit a couple of those things which are mentioned in there, whereas we stress those very critical ones, because we are all talking about responsible AI, whereas in order to have this responsible AI, we have to really and also this AI which would be beneficial, we have to ensure that actual data we are feeding these AI models are really ready for AI models, and also qualitative, not only in terms of the documentation around this data, so only metadata and some surrounding additional documentation, if any, but rather also the content itself, and where this data quality refers to both to data quality management area, which is not typically done in, especially within the open data context. And I oftentimes do hear from very prominent personalities in open data community that actually, why do you study data quality? Because we already know everything about data quality, because it is about metadata. And yeah, actually it is not, but this is not the point at the moment. So this is to say that data quality management perspective, and also domain specific requirements towards this quality, which implies from this application context, so AI, so what AI possess as to be important. So those aforementioned biases, if any, in the data to be acknowledged, purposes of the data collection, and whatever else. So yeah, this would be my response. So whereas we do have very many different scenarios in different continents, I would say that we do share a common pain in very many cases.
Great, great. And I just got warned that actually, I mean, my understanding was this was a 90-minute conversation, but I probably went over time already. Some of you might have thought that was only an hour. So let me quickly go to the last question here. And it's kind of the usual magical wand question, which if you would have a magical wand or a genie that is in a bottle and you can unleash that, what would you ask? What do you think, anyway, with that kind of power you would do as a priority? And a very short kind of one thing. Renata, now is your moment to ask the genie what you want.
Okay, I will ask the genie to really equip those who need to produce the data with the resources they need to produce the key data that we need, and to produce it AI ready. And for those who can enable to recreate this enthusiasm in civil society, now that the citizens are more than ready to get fully engaged in these actions, not only through NGOs, but through citizen initiatives, citizen-driven initiatives, so to match the potential of people with the potential of the tools that we have today.
Great, that's a great idea and a great request. Gretchen, over to you, and then Anastasia, you're the last. You're the last one to ask the genie. No pressure. Over to you, Gretchen.
I would say, in a way, just have more conversations like this. And as we were talking about a bit earlier, you know, some of the aspects around data and AI can be complex. So to bring together people to have conversations like this, I think are incredibly useful. And I think that will be a step towards making data more central to the conversation as it relates to generative AI, where there have been less conversations there. So I just think having more conversations like this would be fantastic.
Great. Anastasia?
So first of all, I would ask Ginny to give me more wishes. to ask for. So, you know.
No, that's the one you can't. That's the one you can't have. I mean,
We didn't have any
that's
rules.
a trick that has been used many times.
Yeah. But other than that, so let me then pick up the most inclusive term of data governance. So proper data governance, because it will include both data literacy and also data quality management and also security, privacy aspects, etc. So if I can't make more than one wishes, I will make one very big wish.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, thanks, Renata, Anastasia, Gretchen. Thanks also for the audience to be with us. And there's only one of the wishes that I can actually help fulfilling, which is the have more conversations, because as I was indicating, this is the first kickoff. And that's also why we kept it deliberately kind of broad and to really scan what are all the issues. And I think this has been a really useful and very in-depth, I would say, kind of scanning of all the issues that are related to the fourth wave of open data, including, of course, what is changing at the input stage, what's changing at the output stage, but also the broader ecosystem, as Renata was emphasizing, and the role of civil society, but also the role, of course, of experts in academia as well, and the private sector. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for sharing your wisdom, and could not have wished a better start of our series than having all of you share your wisdom. So hope to see you. We will share the recording, but also share the details of the next conversation shortly as well. Thanks to everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.